Good evening, everybody. Welcome to Words on Whiskey, episode 27, brought to you by Irish Whiskey Magazine. Thank you all very much for joining us. I'm looking forward to the show immensely, and we've a very special guest. We've got Fionnán O'Connor joining us to make a big reveal that only a few people know about at the moment. So, look, thank you for joining us. As always, I'll wait a few minutes just for people to join the stream and take it from there. Okay, I can see the first few people arriving there. David and Carolyn Taylor, good evening. Hi, welcome everybody, as I said. And what I'll do is I'll start off with the news and try and keep it brief because I think we're going to have a interesting show and maybe a long one. So just kicking off the news, firstly is publicans are encouraged to join the legal challenge against insurance companies. So as you know, there have been some issues around getting claims from the insurance companies for the Irish pubs. So Brian Winters has launched a Save Irish Pubs campaign. So if you are a publican or you know a publican, please encourage them to go to saveirishpubs.ie to help out. There's no cost for them, and the legal fees are all taken care of. So it's a question of just banding together and getting support. And on top of that, of course, we have the end of official level 5 lockdown at the moment as well, which is a huge relief, obviously, for many. Unfortunately, the pubs themselves, a lot of the wet pubs will not be opening immediately, and that has been delayed, and it's obviously a bone of contention, of course. Pubs that do serve food, I think, will be opening from Friday. Other news, we were speaking to Nick Ryan earlier from Thomond Gate. They have distilled their first spirit from the harvesting they did down in Limerick. So come back in 3 years and we'll be able to talk about their whiskey in a bit more detail. On Far Grin, Whiskey Factor have also launched a whiskey. They've launched Against the Grain, a peated single malt with a twist of stout cask finish. It's 46%, 303 bottles, and retailing for €64. And then also released from Origin Spirits, there's the Curragh Founders Wakami Cask Strength Single Malt Irish Whiskey. And that's cask strength at 58.4%, retailing for 110, and a limited number of bottlings on that, I think, is 220 on that. And then this coming Friday, the Irish Whiskey Association have published, will be unveiling a paper that they published, a 10-year report on the development of Irish whiskey and the significance it has had on the Irish economy. And, you know, if you look back at 2010, there were 4 distilleries. I think we're at 37, 38 distilleries. So that should be an interesting one. And it's going to be launched by Minister Paschal O'Donoghue this Friday. So look, lots happening in the news, and expect next week to be even busier, gearing up for Christmas. We hope you're all safe and you're all well. And thank you very much for taking the time to join us. I suppose other news, let me say, well, we'll come to other news later on. But as I said, our guest is Fionnán O'Connor. If you do have any questions for Fionnán, please do post them in the chat. I'm sure he'll be delighted to answer them. And let's just bring in Fionnán.
Hello.
Good evening, Fionnán.
Evening.
How are you? Yes, nice and dark there. How are you?
I know, yeah, that's Baldoyle for you, you know.
That's Baldoyle. Yeah.
The street lights are about the extent of the light pollution out here.
Yes, yeah. How are you keeping? How is everything under the conditions that we're in?
As of today, grand. Everything's changed. No, it's very different going out, largely because one of the Garda checkpoints is right outside my house. So it's a shock not to walk out and just see people being pulled over.
Yeah.
So yeah, there's a certain read of evil in the air, not saying hello to the guards when walking up the road.
Yeah. Well, look, thank you very much for joining us. Obviously, Fionnán doesn't really need much of an introduction, but I'll give him a brief one anyway. Obviously, world-renowned historian on Irish whiskey, publisher, author, writer, speaker, and a bit of a tester now as well, and development in mash bills. So you've been kept quite busy over the last while.
Yeah, I mean, like many people, lockdown just drives you to want to do anything, and then you find yourself doing a lot more than you ever did before. So there's a lot going on. Obviously, the big work has been going on before around the thesis stuff, and that continued more or less on life before and after lockdown in academics, more or less identical. But the other stuff, which all the fun stuff, has ironically happened at the same time. Yeah,
I mean, has it impeded your progress? So you're working on a PhD, which we'll talk about briefly in a while, but has it impeded your progress on that? What kind of obstacles have you come across?
No, it just means I have no excuses to produce work, which is a big part of it. The archives are mostly closed, and when they are open, they're open in a really slow way. So usually you rock up to an archive and you kind of spend the day fishing, and you ask for something and it's not what you want, and you go back and then you ask for something else, and it goes on, and you waste people's time, and it's just kind of understood. Whereas now you have to ask days in advance. They put it out, nobody's touched it in front of you, and you have to, if you want something else, a follow-up piece of information, then you have to wait a few more days to get that. So it ruins the kind of hunting and go. So yeah, that stuff has all been dark. Now thankfully a lot of that was behind me. So a lot of this was just stuff I needed to condense into words, and I'm at that stage where there's a lot more word count, guns pointed to my head saying, can we see some
no distractions now? There's no late night tastings and things like that going on.
Drinking whiskey on
well, speaking of which,
having a grand old time, no nominal.
Yeah, well, look, I will join you on this auspicious occasion. Like I said to you earlier, I was drinking a sample from Beppe. Sent me a sample of Marrowbone Lane, 15-year, or not Marrowbone Lane, Jameson special release, the 15-year-old Millennium release. So I'm delighted to be able to have a drink of that. And Sláinte, everybody. Congratulations on getting out of lockdown. I hope the rest of you are all safe and well. One thing, I mean, obviously you've done a lot of consultancy and you do a lot of presentations in whiskey under normal circumstances, like Irish Whiskey Society, and then guest speaker for a number of other products. That's all been put on the back seat now for the moment, but I suppose that helps the thesis.
Yeah, I mean, everything helps, if only because it reminds me that I actually do love all this stuff, and it is fun, and footnotes can't ever take that away from me. Converting different styles of footnoting and trying to homogenize footnoting styles and where you put parentheses, that can really grade any topic down. But no, it keeps it they're mutually beneficial.
Yeah, I mean, you've done a lot of consultancy. You were involved with the Irish Whiskey Society, and you helped Peter White and the society developed the Marrowbone Lane, and that was an award-winning whiskey in itself. So that was a recreation of a pot still in an older style, and you worked with IDL on that, and that was it.
Yeah, I mean, I just wrote IDL a kind of a stalker letter about what parts of their production process I was most interested in, and then ran it by Willie, and he turned it into a kind of like spoken word performance piece, and then we sent on this document, much to Peter's probable horror, and then Peter got slapped all the work of actually making this happen. No, it was great crack, telling again, I'm sure they just read 3 words of it and decided, okay, well we'll send them back some good whiskey. But it was loads of fun, and again, it was the one who really did all the actual financial reality, and then Willie and I get all the glory. And who made the stuff, they're just an afterthought. So the proportional relationship between effort and reward there.
You got the good end of that then.
Oh, it was great fun, and it was the kind of whiskey I wanted to see from them, and I was convinced that they had it, you know,
Yeah.
that they had trad pot, tails ear cut in sherry cask at a younger age where the oil's still coming through and we could get it at that point. And they sent us two samples, one of which was very old stuff and much more like what's now going out is the Redbreast single casks.
Yeah.
And thankfully we didn't go for it because a lot of people wanted the older thing, and we just somewhat heavily undemocratically William, myself, were allowed to kind of put a loud kibosh on saying our opinions, and we got it. And it's a testament that whole committee were involved. Really, you know, again, it's unfair that Will and I we got the fun bit, you know.
Yeah. Well, I mean, obviously you were a huge part and still are hugely involved in the Irish Whiskey Society, and I think that, you know, that's a huge credit to you and the success that it's had as well over the last while. So, and of course, you do give a lot of talks, and you know, if the truth be told, I think, you know, I've mentioned it before. Certainly, one of my inspirations for getting into whiskey was listening to you talk with great passion about pot still Irish whiskey and the developments over history, and you know, the wrongs and the rights of Irish whiskey and so forth. So I obviously have to thank you for that. But you have been involved in similar kind of projects with other distilleries who have been setting up there recently. So you've done some work with, I know you did some work with Mickle on redeveloping a old Puching style that had oats in it.
The heritage one. I mean, that was with the magazine. That was part of the Seven Sips series, and that was a great fun. And the oats, you know, open smoked out in trim, and they're now doing that permanently, you know.
I mean, that's their standard release now. So I mean, your areas cover predominantly. You're well known for being the expert on pot still whiskey, but I mean, you cover Puching, you cover other spirits as well, and I know you're fond of a glass of wine as well the odd time. So I mean, you do have a bit of a breadth there. What is it, Fionnán, that pot still intrigues you so much about? And why not, you know, single malts or some other historic whiskies?
So there's loads written about single malt, you know. You have to, you know.
You found your niche.
Well, it's not even about finding your niche. It's just finding about what you like to talk about. And when I started writing about pot still, you know, there were a few kind of arch critics of whiskey full stop who were aware of it and had said nice things about it, but nobody was really talking about it. And as you know, a book length project, and so it was almost a chip on the shoulder. I don't know how I took the whole thing personally, the pot still demise, but I took it to heart. And you know, I would like bore people in bars as a student, like, you know, wrenching the heart over the fate of pot still and the near death of the style. And it's, you know, and of course when A Glass Apart started being written, there were only like a couple of them. So now I had no idea that, you know, it would explode the way it did.
I have it here on standby, you know, so I'm sure you're sick of saying it, but
well, that's the big one. That's the new one.
That's the big original one. I think you've even signed it. Yeah. Yes, you have. I can't read out what it says because there's too many F words in it. But no, it's a nice little inscription there. So yeah, I mean that is the de facto book now on pot still Irish whiskey. I mean, obviously it probably needs a rewrite or an update. Or I know when underwent a revision there last year or the year before. But if anybody's looking to really get into the nitty gritty of pot still Irish whiskey, that's a great start there. And maybe there's another book in the pipeline in the future. Who knows?
Who knows? Who can possibly know? Who could have that information?
Well, what do you make now of the development of pot still Irish whiskey, and I suppose the development and the growth of Irish whiskey over the last few years?
Okay, well, maybe I should stop drinking New Make and actually drink some whiskey.
You're on New Make. Okay.
Yeah, well, I was in a distillery earlier today, so you know,
of course, yes,
that was somewhere floating around the like early end of the hearts. No, it's the late end of the hearts. So,
right.
But this is Redbreast, but this is one quite close to my heart. So nobody wanted him because he was so ugly. So I got him for a song. Had to stick him back together with tape. So this is the Fitzgerald and Co. Redbreast,
right,
from the tentative foot in the water re-release of Redbreast.
So that was the transition period, isn't it, from leaving Gilbey's and going to...
Well, when it left Gilbey's, it ceased to be. People forget there was a blip where Redbreast wasn't there, and then I've had this conversation with Willie Murphy quite a few times. Or at least more appropriately had this conversation with me that, had the Fitzgerald Redbreast of the 90s not done well, Redbreast probably would have, trickled off into the good night. So looking back at it, there's more astounding Redbreasts, more expensive Redbreasts even, but it's such a weird kind of thought project even to know this stuff. And of course it does, modern Redbreast doesn't taste the same as Gilbey's Redbreast. Obviously, it certainly doesn't taste the same as the stuff that was coming out of Bow Street. Fundamentally different liquid. But even then, you have this weird, I don't know what it was. It was a kind of like linseed oil meets ginger maceration into Redbreast. And now they've kind of pulled back on that. It's all a bit cleaner. The sherry casks have become more or less prominent in various years. This now it doesn't help that the cork was fucked, and there will be some bits of cork floating around in there. But I remember smelling this for the first time in so long, and it's almost like the oversoaked tea of Redbreast. Everything's a bit sloppier, a bit drier, not as sweet, not as it feels like the Redbreast qualities were left in there a bit too long. You forgot about it and came back, and it's all a bit muddy.
But they were distributors, weren't they, Fitzgerald? Mm-hmm. They weren't obviously in the distilling side at all.
And Edward Dillon, and eventually returned into the bosom of IDL as a core product, and never looked back since. Yeah.
But so going back to the question then, in terms of what is it about pot still in particular that you find so interesting, and do you think it is synonymous with Irish whiskey? Is it, as is commonly quoted, the quintessential Irish whiskey?
I mean, it certainly used to be. Like if you look, and again, an awful lot of my time these days involves looking. It was overwhelmingly Irish whiskey. Throughout the 1800s, malt whiskey accounted for about, and I've done the numbers from 1820 to 1890. And when you're starting there's no column still, so the math is a bit different, so you have to adjust. But even keeping to pot still product, malt never superseded 5% of gross national product. Tiny and almost exclusively made in Ulster. Coleraine. Now, of course, that's legal whiskey. There was an awful lot of malt putching, and of course there was pot still like whiskey made in Scotland as well. Their muddled history, and I think this often gets forgotten, is that they're joined at the hip, whether they like it or not. There was huge amounts of Scotch imported into Ireland, huge amounts of Irish whiskey exported to Scotland, huge amounts of very innocuous hard liquor floating around the Sea of Moyle that was getting, acquiring custom stamps on both sides. But as you go through the 19th century, you eventually, you see at the beginning of the 19th century, you see a kind of fork in the road. And the big dry part of my thesis is why that fork happened. Why isn't it more blurred? And by the end of the 19th century, by the High Victorian period, you see near dichotomy. So when Alfred Barnard came to Ireland, there were 2 distilleries out of 28 devoted to malt whiskey, and they were both in the north. They would have been Coleraine and Bushmills. There's a weird hiccup in Cork, but if you look down at, they were making mixed mash as well. Which would have been the Glen Distillery. So when he writes Whiskey Distilleries of the United Kingdom in 1886, Scotland is full of malt, and Irish whiskey is either Irish pot still or a few exceptions, or of course in both countries, column still. And of course there was anyway, I don't want to get too lost in details, but certainly when and again, there's an awful lot of bad history out there told to sell specific products as if they were the arch traditional Irish whiskey. And usually it's just, especially with the source market, up until recently, was just everyone had the same thing, and you had to validate that it was the source, or it was the root. And Irish whiskey has gone through at least 2, if not 3, crises of personality over the 20th century alone.
Yeah.
And there certainly was, the people who were into pot still not that long ago, even like this is like 2010, when you spoke to people like Leo or Willie or, many of the obsessives in the Whiskey Society. Mm-hmm. And it's amazing because you're on the back of 40 years of sustained propaganda telling you that Irish whiskey is smooth, triple distilled, blended, a milder, unpeated alternative to Scotch. And then you have people still raving about this viscous, oily skeleton in the cupboard, and they're reaching back for the heavier Prad pot, reaching back to, again, if you try, it's getting thin on the ground, but old powers, real, NCAD, Dublin distilled pot still powers was, like something you'd left in the back of the shed for too long. It was, again, oily, but it also just had this strange, dark, musty resin superimposed on that oil. You get, obviously you get malt whiskey that's damp and kind of unctuous, but this was that on oil, and it feels like something you should be pouring in some sort of old form of lawnmower, these dense petroleum products. And it's demanding, but it's so fun and it's so different. It's not demanding in the way that peat is demanding or the way that rye is demanding. It was idiosyncratic. It was strange. And when you have, that image of pot still, of Irish whiskey's older identity, this is the drink that was making strides into replacing cognac during phylloxera. It was a heavier substance. Yeah. And you see that lightened out first through the switch to blends, and then through a lightening of even pot still itself. It's still oilier than malt whiskey, but the fact that it was so close to extinction, that it was so undersung even by ourselves, and then the fact that it's just so odd, it's so different, it's so strange. It reminds me of, I'm a romantic at the worst and the best of times, when it comes to some of these drinks. But when I think of pot still, I think of old pub. I think of pubs that still had rugs in them. That strange, like accumulating the sense of everything that had been there before, this dense linoleum thing, and it's not entirely approachable, and yet at the same time it's so incredible. It coats your mouth, it won't leave. It's such a heavy drink, and that's what drew me to it, even beyond the just heartstrings for a sob story.
Yeah, the history obviously is hugely fascinating, and you've done some immense work there in championing pot still Irish whiskey and Irish whiskey as a result as well. So I know you've done some work there with you've done some work with Boann, you've done some work with Killowen, you've done some work with Ecklinville and Blackwater as well, in terms of looking at different mash bills. I suppose, firstly, we're not all super technical in whiskey, we just enjoy it. But in terms of mash bill, perhaps you might want to just take us through what a mash bill is and what a particular pot still would comprise of.
Yeah, there's a lot of mentions of terms like work here, as opposed to like everyone you mentioned just wearing their ears off in a pub long enough, while they'll, eventually, do the work themselves. But it has been great. And people are interested, When I started, just Peter Mulryan sent me an email saying, send me everything. I want to know, we'll make it, blah, blah, blah. They've been chomping at the bit. Ecklinville were, of course, the BBC and I thing on Cumber, which is the last Ulster Irish pot still closed in the 50s. That recreation was haunting, just to see a specific distillery come back. But mash bills, okay, like, what is Irish pot still whiskey? Why isn't it just whiskey made in a pot still? And you look at this precedence, and all these terms are 20th century inventions. You have the What is Whiskey trial, the Royal Commission in 1908 starts creating hard terms, and we've kind of received them. And Of course, a lot of these terms are ambiguous before then. Things get called malt that are not malt whiskey, have malt in them. People get called, pure. And, pure is one of the first words to get nailed down. Yes. But there is a sense of Irish pot still being in discrete comparison to Scotch pot still, or by proxy, Ulster, malt. There's a whole tradition, not just Bushmills and Coleraine, rest its soul, of illicit malt whiskey being made. Donegal Poitín was basically Islay new make. It was a very, very smoky drink, and you can see Donegal from Islay. I was reminded of that recently, and the Inishowen Peninsula specifically, and you talk about Inishowen as this lost style of Irish whiskey itself, and that was seemingly peated malt new make. So again, is pot still more Irish than that, or is that just died out of the narrative? Everything's history is dirty and muddled, and you come out dripping again more like oversoaked tea than Arizona iced tea in a tin.
How do you overcome that, Fionnán? How do you overcome the smoke from the mirrors and actually get to the facts, I suppose, in terms of what's that, especially when you're dealing with historical documentation that's 100 years old?
Well, again, and there's two differences, and I think a big problem with the way a lot of Irish whiskey history has been told is, unfortunately, there hasn't been a lot of sustained rigor in holding people to their word, as it were. We tend to repeat things, and we forget that not everything said in the past is true, and B, not everything said in the present is true. Even more pressingly. But especially the past, people tend to read, if you read something from the 1920s that's talking about the Middle Ages, history in the 19th century could be appalling. It was sloppy. It was racist half the time. It was badly researched. It was built on mythologies. So you have to look at all of these old documents as products of their own era, as well as of past eras. So you see, and some of this stuff just gets taken at its word and put out again and again and again. And then it becomes gospel because you're in an echo chamber. So it's really just about trying to get through primary sources as you can, and then secondary sources as you must, and trying to kind of negotiate those terms, get a sense of, not picking out a specific thing. That's where the conspiracy theorist and bad history overlap, where you see one piece of information and you decide this is central. I found a distillery in Baldoyle, and that means Baldoyle was the center of the Irish whiskey world. No, it wasn't. It's about establishing some sort of a map and trying to, even if there was one person in Baldoyle in 1922 who said Baldoyle is the capital of whiskey, that does not make it so. So I think that's the big sound barrier, as it were. And then the other is just bullshit, of which there's plenty, self-eating.
And a lot of that would come from marketing, or,
marketing gets a bad rap. I think a lot of people, I don't think anybody sits down and says, right, at a boardroom and says, okay, this is how we're going to misbrand the history of Irish whiskey. We'll catch them on the slide. I think it's a lot more haphazard than that, and just a lot of stuff gets repeated. That's and a lot, especially in Irish whiskey now, we've started borrowing a lot of stuff sloppily from the history of Scotch, and that was one thing that really worried me in the early days when I was doing A Glass Apart. Was there was a lot of interest in Irish whiskey, but it was being sold as kind of Scotland light, and that again tugged the heartstrings, because pot still had come so close to disappearing. I remember when Green Spot, you had to come to Mitchell's and or to obviously you could get them at like Celtic or one of these specialist retailers, but you couldn't get popularly even in Ireland. I used to work for a man named Brian Sheehy out in San Francisco, who runs a small empire of bars, and every time I went home, I was given a briefcase basically and told, bring Green Spot back. And now you can readily get Green Spot. So even when I was starting to write about pot still, there was a certain mystique that has vanished for the good, for the most part. But it wasn't that long ago that this stuff was on respirator.
Tell me, what do you see out there now that in terms of distilleries that are doing innovative stuff? Who's exciting you in terms of what they're doing?
Well, obviously Boann, and we'll touch on that because I'm just that's their new make that I'm drinking now. But there's so many, I mean, Brendan Carty, mentions my name a lot, so it's only fair to return the favor. He's doing incredibly cool stuff, where you're smoking, he's taking turf and just shoveling it in and, smoking his own grain, smoking his own oats, making pot still out of that, smoked pot still, direct flame still. Ecklenville are, I don't need to sing their praises any more than anyone has. They're fantastic guys. They have been super, and it's funny because again, and I should be clear, part of the thesis obligation, I don't, anything that comes from the thesis, I don't charge for. I think that information is public cultural inheritance, and it's my obligation morally as a researcher to make that free of charge to whoever's seriously interested. And I've tried to do that as openly and as non-discriminately as possible. But it's hard because a lot of distilleries don't have either the vision, or I don't want to use terms like vision because that's a bit bullying, the financial situation or the placement yet to take time off a major campaign and do wonky stuff that doesn't comply with whatever. And but at the same time, there's a few of them who, at the drop of a hat, Jarlath and Graham and the lads will up at Ecklenville will say, yeah, we'll do it, So I remember the day I found the old Cumber mash bill. It was in the Public Records Office of Northern Ireland in Belfast.
I remember that,
yeah. And we went
drove you there.
The Dookie York pub that night and had a hoolie with Jarlath. And that was the first real, I had found references to things. Usually court cases are great because when people sue each other, they tend to say things you can hold them accountable for. But it was so odd because it's the North and it's its own, archive, and because the Public Records Office of Northern Ireland took a very serious interest in industrial history. And, of course, Belfast is the only part of Ireland that received the Industrial Revolution was Ulster, via building, linen, etc. But column distilling as well. People forget that the whole narrative about the Irish turning their back on the column still is not true. Belfast was a column powerhouse. It was mirrored with Glasgow, and was pumping out huge amounts of liquid at the time. Cumber, again, it was the first time I found the procedure of a distillery in depth, where there were just literally the books and a whiskey that I had before in the past, and could kind of tag a flavor to a recipe. Because of course, oats, the first grain of Irish whiskey is raw barley. The second, the lost grain, is oats, and oats vanished in the 70s. And you're looking back and you start realizing as you go further back how prevalent those were. So actually what I have here, courtesy Alan Cullen's uncovered stash. Again, the cork I have a bad luck with cork, so it had to be put into a different bottle. But this is old Locks. And so Locks was, their archives were donated to the state when they closed down. So they're all, and there's nothing special about me. It takes 10 minutes to get a, National Library card. The manuscripts reading room is a wonderful resource. They were extremely helpful, and Locke stuff is all there. It almost amazes me that the stuff is so available and it hasn't been seen yet. I feel like a child
Yeah, well, what does it feel like to uncover stuff that hasn't come up before? Because we'll touch on something now that you came across there very recently, and with permission, if I can share that, those images.
Well, this is also your original question about mash bill. So Locks, this is old Locks pot still, and this was about 40% malt, 40% raw barley, 15% oats, 5% wheat. In the early 20th century, that 5% would have been rye, and then they kind of repivoted to wheat. But it's fascinating to try and taste this now, having seen that in concrete and having seen how muddled the past was. And all you can do is take, we know wheat and rye from American whiskey, but we kind of have to look through this, again, funhouse mirror of, well, it exists, but it exists in combination with maize. How much can you really draw as a comparison? Whereas oats is, anyone's guess, other than a few novelty projects, and older Irish whiskey. So it's fascinating to see that mash bill inheritance tagged to documents, tagged to answer your final question, people who are prepared to go out and muck around with it, you know.
Yeah. So mash bill essentially, in a crudest form, is a recipe for, you know, porridge.
Yeah, it's you know, whiskey is evaporated ale and ale is fermented schlop, you know, and the mash bill is taking it back to the schlop level. And obviously in American whiskey, mash bills are a huge thing because the whole, I mean, it's almost, again, the like musical geometry of bourbon and rye with 51% either way, but you can have high rye bourbon, you can have low rye and pure rye, essentially pure rye, you know, like MGP type stuff versus say like, you know, Bullet bourbon has quite a high, I think it's 28% rye versus your standard bourbon is about, you know, 13 versus wheated bourbon. So all that logic was there. And it's funny because if you look at Irish whiskey historically looks a lot more like American whiskey in its logic, where you get a huge obsession with mash bills. Malt, again, is there mainly in Ulster and in illicit distilling. Although even in illicit distilling, again, the heritage putching was based on smoked oats being thrown in with smoked malts, or smoked malted oats with smoked malted barley.
Well, I think that's what Porrick did, isn't it, in his heritage putching? Yeah,
well, you get words. Even now, they're dying out because, unfortunately, most, you know, hard putching today is essentially homemade rum. It's, you know, in the age of Lidl and Londis, it's just easier to buy sugar. But you get words in Donegal Irish, you know, words like belty, which specifically means oats in putching, oat and adjunct. You know, it's woven into the vocabulary. And again, so there's that. Now that's folk practice, as it were. It's not hard mash bill. So that's a thing I have great fun talking to Brendan about, is words like belty and whatnot. And obviously he's mucking about with peated oats at the moment. And you know, Buillacown and all these extinct.
Well, we did that experiment as well ourselves with the 7 Sips, and Ecklenville were very kind to distill that as well. So
yeah, I mean, again, the 7 Sips series of articles, which I know is still going. So if anyone's waiting for them, that's me lagging there. But the fact that Ecklenville were so quick, you know, usually we have to go begging for someone to do something odd. Ecklenville were prepared to do it in the morning. And again, it was enormous fun. So there is, you know, when I started writing A Glass Apart, there was the heartstrings for pot still, and then now that's still there. But of course, there is, when you take mash bill as a premise and you're looking backwards, especially at really old stuff like, again, like Buillacown, Inishowen. Inishowen's not nearly as old as the other. But these folk concepts, then you're in another train again, and that's really neo, that kind of Irish whiskey. That's a long dead link, you know, as opposed to, you know, oats is something that kind of disappeared very very thinly, but was still drunk. A lot of people have had old Irish pot still, or Irish whiskey, let's say, for politeness sake, that's had loads of oats in it, and they don't know because they were never told. So I think part of that is also just to tell people, no, you were drinking something with 15% oats in it. No, that had, you know, up to 20% oats. And to see how fake, because they're all going to disappear. It won't be for, I remember when you could get Old Powers relatively easily.
Yeah.
And now you can't. We spent a year with the whiskey side trying to hunt down. Brian's been on every auction trying to get a bottle of old actual John's Lane distillate. And it's difficult now. And it will become more difficult. And, you know, Cumber the same. So maybe that era is passing. And if we don't reclaim that or investigate it now, then we never will have quite the same unbroken opportunity, in the way that, like, looking back at, you know, again, weird Tudor era mashes is genuinely, like I said, essentially a fun craft revive. You know, it's not it's a stab in the dark for a bit of crack, you know.
Yeah. Listen, going to, you mentioned there the BBC and the documentary. Can you just tell us a little bit about the documentary you're involved in, that I think we're going to see released sometime in March?
May.
Hopefully. May, is it?
Well, who knows? They're back in lockdown up there. So, you know, the filming got, and I know you were on that. lugged you up to Belfast to sit in front of the bright lights. But that's been a lot of fun, and obviously that has bounced around us. It began as Irish whiskey, and then it turned into Ulster whiskey, and then it turned back into Irish whiskey, and then they decided they wanted to go to Islay, so ended up taking a boat to Islay, and ended up giving Jim McEwen his first redbreast. So if anything, the friend at hand single cask redbreast, made sure we put the best.
Well, you did put a good foot forward there, didn't you?
Yeah, it was like a drug deal. The director told me, I pulled up, on the train, and Paul Kane was there in a van with the redbreast behind. We kind of did of course it was all social distancing in full force, so it looked really suspicious, him leaving it on the one thing and me picking it up. But that's been loads of fun. And
when's that coming to an end? Is that filming finished now? Is it?
No, there's more to be done. It's just, again, it's filming in the age of COVID, so when they're on lockdown at the moment, they have to pause everything, and then they won't be, and etc. So I think the next plan is Dublin, which would be the first film we get done south. And originally, or at one stage, they had plans of going to the US, but I think travel in COVID is just so difficult that got.
Because Pennsylvania they wanted to go to, wasn't it?
Yeah, talk about the Whiskey Rebellion, because actually, the head of the Whiskey Rebellion was from Dungannon, James McFarland. So I was telling them, you can, and of course that's the north. So I was saying, look, we go out to the grave, and the grave is great, shot by cowards, blah blah blah. But lay down the James McFarland memorial cask of Irish rye. Again, who's to say what that becomes? It's still on the go, but it's been a lot of fun. And Sean, the director's been great, and Mark. So it's me. I'm there as historical advisor and co-presenter, and then there's Mark, who's the real professional presenter. They've all been wonderful.
What's your favorite part of the whole thing? Is it finding the original recipes? Is it producing the original recipes, or is it tasting the original?
all three.
All three.
There's a certain thrill in finding, and even aside from recipes, just stuff, because you find a lot. You go. I mean, I took whole trips to places hoping to find stuff, and just spent the whole, the Cork City Archives, for example. I went down and found almost nothing, and I was really disappointed. And I expected a whole lot, and they had some of the old Hewitt's family, Cork, before Cork Distillers, Hewitt's family. Letters, but they were all personal letters, so it's interesting, but it's not relevant. What John Hewitt was saying to his daughter, on her anniversary. It's so again, you can never control. And unfortunately, what we're talking about, production was the last thing to get preserved. You go up to the Dunville's board meetings are in the Public Records Office in Belfast, and they don't use the word whiskey once. It's all like Dickensian Victoriana speech saying, the members of the board do forthwith declare the annual blah blah blah, and it's as respectable as possible. There's a very it's almost noticeable by absence is the mention of alcohol, and so it's when you find versus Cumber, which I saw was there, and then I asked, and they said they didn't know what had happened to it. It was gone, and then I went back and started doing something else, and this guy comes with a massive box that they found in the basement. He said, knock yourself out. And it was all there. Just suddenly this flash in a second, and everything from like the 1930s to when they closed down in the 1950s. So that's a thrill. And then of course seeing it distilled, is always fascinating to now you're doing it with different equipment, different, of course, even the malt is more efficient, the yeast is more efficient, but touching it in some strange way, because we'll never have old new make, nobody kept. It's hard enough to get old mature bottles, let alone get like you're not going to old Cumber distillate. So you're just kind of guessing. Am I looking for similarities when they're not there, or are they there, or are these what I think they are?
Yeah,
fascinating.
Well, here is the thing that I think you got a big thrill out of finding as well. Do you want to tell us a little bit about this?
So this is ending up as like one little footnote in the thesis, and it was one of the most fun things to find. But it's not part of, the thesis is very specific. It's the history of mash bills. So once upon a time, I was on track to become a medievalist. That was where all the joy of manuscript came from, first out in California and then back in Dublin. When I started to, I used to do Dante after Dante was kind of my thing. Dante's effect on other people. Anyway, it was always a joy to kind of touch the bits of whiskey that go back to them, because there is an awful lot of bullshit. And that always got under my skin, coming from that background where you hear just this again, smoke and mirrors nonsense about old Irish monastic history or this or that, some very basic confusing of moments in history that were centuries upon centuries apart. And again, most people are not doing this intentionally. They're just receiving information from one place or another. But the thought hit me at one point. I was talking to Charlie Roach, and I was wondering what the first use of, where you might find the first use of the phrase Ishkabaha, Ushkava, whatever you want to call it, the origin behind the word whiskey. And I was looking, and it's funny because I think I've found it, which is what that is, and that's now in Trinity. But more importantly, well, not more importantly, but differently than that, it also kind of tags in back into the story itself. The first record of, so yeah, the go back one. Another one. There we go. So there's the actual Onishka Bahad. You can see or Onishka Bahad. It's different spelling because, of course, it's quite antiquated Irish, but the same concept. And what that is it's what's called a materia medica, which have been kind of a doctor needs to know book, a textbook, belonging to a doctor named Tygo Quing, composed by him, belonging to a doctor named Abu O'Lehan, and you have these medical textbooks across the Gaelic world at that time. You have what were known as olives, which would have been, originally many things, but in the context we're talking about, hereditary families of doctors. And you had families like the O'Hickeys, the O'Shiels, the O'Lees. In Scotland, infamously, you had the McVeha, literally Beha life, the Beaton.
All right, okay.
A total coincidence with whiskey, but a lot of them, the Beatons are quite infamous in Scotland as the kind of most noticeable branch of that culture. But hilariously, Beaton is an anglicization of Baha, or in Gaelic Vaha, life. And a lot of them were trade descriptions. Hickey is healer, doctor. So again, they were. In fact, Macbeha, it also becomes Macbeth. It's one of the few names that begins with a Mac that's not a patronymic. Because it was son of, in a metaphorical sense, in the way that a student in modern Irish is Maclean, son of knowledge or son of learning. Son of life would have been doctor. So it's a weird kind of glitch, and then it becomes Beaton. But what was fascinating about that manuscript, so the very first record of distilling in Ireland is in the Red Book of Ossory, yes. And that's down in Kilkenny, or it was written in Kilkenny, and it's not actually a record of whiskey. What it is more specifically is it's a copy of another manuscript, more or less, not word for word, but it's clearly cribbed version of a manuscript called Consilia Medicinalia, written in Italy. And again, a lot of, obviously distilling is much older. I think people get confused when they talk about the history of distillation as distillation versus the history of the distillation of ethanol, of high proof, potable alcohol in the sense that we mean when we say alcohol, and it's very difficult to separate a low boiling compound like alcohol on its own. And you can, you look at weird mezcal stills in Mexico and whatnot with pouring cold water to separate them. But bar kind of going out of your way, in which case you'd probably describe going out of your way. The kind of the model system was the worm coil, the serpentum, and that the kind of breakthrough academic article about the serpentum was the Consilia Medicinalia. It was written by a guy named Taddeo Alderotti in Bologna, oldest university in Europe, and it gets spread across Europe. up to Ireland. The Red Book of Ossory is really just, again, a crib of that wider European understanding. And of course, Aqua Vita disseminating this quickly. What that is exactly the same manuscript. It's the Concilia Medicinalia translated into Irish. So there's even that weird history that, again, it and the Red Book of Ossory are the same text, except that one says Uisce Baha and the Red Book of Ossory says Aqua Vita. If you zoom in to the text, and I did a zoom because of course it's extremely antiquated. What in Scotland would be called classical Gaelic, and what the other way. There it is. So you can see on Uisce Vehed, again it's different spelling, but same phrase. And again, classical Gaelic and Irish and Scots Gaelic had become different languages vocally, but they had a shared kind of high literary standard, and that's what that would be written in.
So this is as far as you're aware the first reference to Uisce Baha.
Unless someone said something earlier, it's 1415. There's one kind of red herring that pops up. A lot of people quote, which is the Annals of Clon MacNoise, which is what that other picture is. Well, no, it's not actually. But the Annals of Clon MacNoise is not actually what it says it is. So the Annals of Clon MacNoise actually only exists in an English translation in 1627. So it's long after 1405 of an Irish text that is itself extinct. Now, I don't know why people continue to cite the Annals of Clon MacNoise. It's a great story. At Christmas, Richard McGragnall dying from a surfeit of Aqua Vita, to him Aqua Mortis. And if you look at other Irish annals, they all say, a number of them say exactly the same thing, and they do exist in their original. So why we pick out the Annals of Clon MacNoise, I have no idea. They weren't even written at Clon MacNoise. Again, there was a translation by a guy named Conal MacOhan, and in the Tudor period. But if you look at, say, what that image is the Annals of Connacht, which is the same. They clearly were copied from the same thing. Even the lost original of the other one, because they say the same things. And the way Irish annals work in theory, they all kind of tend to start with the same history, and that's the Ionian material. That's the like Colm Killick stuff. And they all believe that they're the descendant texts of that. They're the true history from that point on. And then if you get them further and further away from old Iona, they start being different, and you start seeing that they're competing religious centers like Armagh or Clon MacNoise, claiming to be the descendant of Iona, and the narrative gets a bit muddled. So what really those are is part of the Clon MacNoise cluster, if that makes sense. But the one we quote is almost arbitrary. But it is great crack reading it. The chieftain just having too much of the stuff and keeling over. But they are annals. They weren't written in 1405. Even the original Annals of Connacht go up into the 1550s. So looking backwards, whereas the O'Quing is a direct text. It is written then from then. And again, interesting as all hell. Before the pandemic happened, I was meant to go to Scotland to look at some of the Beaton stuff, because you then start seeing exact copies, not exact copies, but cribbed copies again, appearing in Scotland of this manuscript, or there's several translations like it appearing in the Beaton archives. And you're clearly looking at this kind of shared Gaelic world of medical information being spread from one end to the other. So the idea that we rocked up with a pot of whiskey and taught the Scots how to do it is that's something there's no real evidence for. But you get these ideas of dissemination of knowledge. There's a lot more, and it doesn't just have to come from the Gaelic world. Of course, there's straight to the veins from Europe by other means as well. Again, the Red Book of Ossory was written by Norman Franciscans, so a very, very different tradition altogether.
Yeah. Okay. Well, look, a really exciting find, and amazing that it hasn't gone noticed before. So well done on finding that. I think it's a.
I know Matt Healy wants to do, because we can show it here via the link, but to print it you need Trinity's permission. So I think Matt wants to do a full, exegesis thing down the road. So
well, okay, look, let's talk about a little bit about your thesis, and then what it is you're doing now with Boann, because obviously this is groundbreaking stuff and a very exciting project. So maybe you'd like to tell us a little bit about that. Yeah,
well, this is the fun stuff. This is the news. So
this is the news.
He was putting the newsies what he did. The thesis, so on the back of A Glass Apart, when that came out 5 years ago, as of Halloween, I ended up being sent on this weird board B mission to Hong Kong, because they sell a lot of Irish seafood in Hong Kong and Macau, and then into China from there. And they've been kind of selling this image of Ireland as this like unspoiled, Tir-na-nog type island, and the casino owners in Macau eat it up and just buy rakes upon rakes of whatever the case may be, Galway oysters. And I was there on behalf of Irish Drink, but they didn't export anything to Macau. So it was mysterious why I was there. And then it was made clear to me I was kind of just there to show people a good time and get them to sign off on the shellfish. But there was a chef who was the main speaker. His name is Marcin Mokonumera. He's now my thesis advisor. And Marcin is inspiring and wonderful, and he's been a fantastic advisor. And he's not only a chef, he's a really leading food historian in Ireland about the history of Irish food, from oral sources and all this stuff. And you see him all the time on TG Cahir, clenching away. But also, he runs symposiums and this and that. And he said, look, we could get you a bit of funding for this. So that was, he basically organized the whole thing. He organized the submission to the Irish Research Council. I got, again, just extremely lucky to find someone who was prepared to kind of fight my corner. And then I woke up in the morning and I was enrolled in a PhD. And the official question of the PhD is, the research question is, what were the guiding imperatives in the trajectory of Irish mash bills from 1760 to 1975, and how can the specifically gastronomic aspects of those mashes drive innovation in contemporary Irish distilling? Question mark. 1760 because it's when it became mandatory to register, and 1975 when the last end of consolidation into the new Middleton facility. So the end of again.
Could you not have found a more specific topic to write about?
You're saying that. You look at most theses, they're even more, again. Now, and that's why it's because that, you have to be so specific, really, that, crack like this with finding old medieval manuscripts, that ends up as one footnote, as seen in Tygo Quing footnote, etc., and then move right on. So there's so much stuff that I've been doing that's loads of fun that has no outlet at all except wearing people's ears off in small distilleries in the morns. But there's always been the understanding that the end of this would, the summation of it is there's 2 more years of thesis writing left, but it would culminate in some sort of historical recreation of recreating a series of these old mash bills in shared circumstances. So that's what we're doing now with Boann, and thanks be Matty and Michael and the Cooney family all being on board. They've given me the run of the place for the month of December, and the slave labor of Michael and the rest of the staff to distill old stuff, turn all these like weird percentages into liquid and see what the hell any of this would look like. And it's all being done, and I wanted Boann specifically because they're triple distilling in large bulbous stills. They're on the classical mold, and not all this stuff was, in the same facilities, obviously, but they're as close, bar like convincing the NCAD to run up the old power stills or something. It's the right shape, it's the right idea. Their core product is core pot still, so there's a healthy control, and then everything else about the production has to be the same fermentation time, same cut point, same everything. So we try desperately to wear off other variables as we can, and of course you're always fighting, especially when you deal with sensory panels, you're fighting people's individual biology, but trying to create some sort of apparatus of understanding at least the gastronomic side of those mashes. Obviously, so many things. And that's a whole other side of it. People weren't doing this for their health. You have everything from the malt tax to its repeal, to the active union, to the corn laws, to their repeal. There's so many forces that are purely pragmatic that have shaped mash bill history. And they're always in tandem. They're always in tug of war with what a distillery wants to do, what they're doing under duress, what they'd rather do, etc. So that's part of it too, but this is the specifically gastronomic logic, and we have no way of knowing like what the hell happens when you cough up the percentage of one adjunct versus another, or you drop another. And trying to create, Irish whiskey has lost so much behind it, shed so much as it was racing to survive. It threw bits of what's his name? The founder of the Folklore Commission in I think the 1910s. There's a great line where he says, the house is on fire and we're saving the furniture. That Irish folklore was disappearing. The generation who believed in this stuff were dying off. And you're trying to write everything down. And there's a certain element, again, with oats that, all this stuff is vanishing fast. It has been vanishing very fast for a very long time. And some of it is actually gone. And we're looking back at it and saying, well, what the hell does any of this mean? Why do you have Samuel Morwood talking about what one distillery prefers over another distillery in the 1830s? And so this whole month, I get up every morning and I go to Boann up in Drogheda, and I watch them, play, and it's so much fun. That's what I'm drinking, by the way, the new make. So I can't tell you because for the sake of scientific rigor, I'm not actually allowed to say what any of this stuff is.
So essentially what you've done is you've taken, how many historic mash bills have you taken? So you can't tell us how many you have? Nope.
So the reason all this has to stay a secret is because first it gets sent to a gas chromatography lab just for background stuff, and we have some good friends in Kentucky who are happy to supply a lot of that data, who are used to dealing with mash breakdowns. Then there'll be a sensory panel, and this is the big news. This happened in like 3 days. Originally, we were going to have this interview, and again, we discussed this ourselves, and then send the invitations out. And I know you've been a big force in knocking on doors, as has Jack O'Shea and Conor Ryan,
and Willie.
And especially, I think Jack knocked on quite a few doors, and well, all of them, and Willie Murphy too. And suddenly, people started calling me up and saying, "I want to be on the panel." Absolutely, love to. So it has to be production, distilling or blending, flavor creating roles. As much as I'd love to just have a hoolie with all my, brand ambassador friends, which we can do too. Yeah. There's only so much glassware, and cover as many distilleries as we can. So I think we're up to 19 as of this morning. It was meant to be 25, and we'll see. We have to push. Mick and Shawneen from Mulligan's are supplying all the glassware, the ISOs, and it's a full day thing. But the idea is to try, and and again, this is all on a shoestring academic budget. I have to rely on people's goodwill to come, and they were so quick. I mean, Louise, Alex, Noel, there were people, I barely pressed send and they were replying. And I don't want to start listing people because they're, I don't want to leave anybody out. But we've gotten a fantastic panel almost out of thin air, and it's purely on goodwill. It's
and the plan of the day is to do which? Is to go to Boann, do a taste, or maybe not even go into Boann. But
Boann, it would probably be in Grange Gorman campus. The hope, and we're still working the details of this out, but of course they've set up a brewing and distilling program, and the hope is to get the students to do the slave labor there, the class and whatnot, because they've also had a kind of a starved year doing online coursework and whatnot, and it would be a great opportunity for them to meet the industry, even if they're just, pouring stuff and talking to them in a tea break. So again, there's been a lot of love all across the board, and even again, not to go into names because I'll just start forgetting people. But like, I was on the phone to Ned Gahan down in Waterford. They're just making malt. For Ned, this is purely curiosity and at best and goodwill. Absolutely.
Well, if I'm not mistaken, it's the single piece of research, the single largest piece of research, and the first time this sort of thing has been done in Ireland.
Yeah, and again, we wanted to keep it trade. Obviously, the liquid belongs to Boann after I'm done with it, and they can do what they like with it. And I don't expect them to throw money down the drain, and it's exciting for them too. It's free art, and
Well, they're very hats off to them as well for coming on board and.
Exactly what I want. They've never said no. Some of the stuff is quite demanding because, for instance, we're doing each mash more than once because the recycled paints can't be contaminated from the previous one. When we of course, that's only a small difference, but it is a difference. So when we take off the sample, it's going to be tried. We want to eliminate as many variables as possible. So they've been very good. They have to keep, I think, and I don't want to speak for them because I think Matty would be able to speak better to that. What they intend to do with the cast. I know they have a kind of a program in the works to sell some of them off. You know, I don't know the logic. It's ultimately the agreement I have with them is they do exactly what I want for the project, and then I'm happy to stand in front of a camera and say how excited I am to be there, which I am, thrilled. And you know, and Michael Walsh, I've known since he was in Dingle, you know, and his career first started. And you know, again, if there's anyone whose ears I wore off for years in a pub, it's poor Michael Walsh. So the fact that it should be him doing it is great. And you know, and he's a young distiller who has come into it when Dingle were first starting up, and he's become, you know, it's incredible to see him up there now making calls and whatnot on how we do all this. But it's just starting. You know, the first few days were obviously just fermentations and whatnot and getting it into the system. It's only now, I can't tell you which one it is, but this is the third of the mashes we've done, and I haven't tried yet. It's at a modest
69%.
No, it's 70 something. What? What the fuck is that? Sorry, I genuinely haven't. I nabbed this on the way down here off this. It's literally just, you know, stuck it under the receiver. And again, you wonder like how different any of these would be. And of course, these are triple distilled. Obviously, if we double distill, we get different flavor retentions and so forth. But I wanted it to be triple distilled, large bulbous pots, a modern incarnation of both the old pot still titans of Dublin and Cork and the Midlands, and a reflection against a control that is set up to imitate, you know, what pot still really means today.
So these are all old style. Are they all old style mash bills?
Yeah, they are.
And are they all based on records that you would have come across in your research then, in terms of finding?
They've decimalized in the sense that if you actually look at old records, so there's one. There's Old Cumber. That's not one of them. That's what Ecklinville were doing, because of course Ecklinville was a very different project. Ecklinville was, you know, most of this stuff is me just running around having fun with people on the back of the research, and you know, because Cumber was the last old Irish pot still made in Ulster, there was quite a sentimental feeling in Ecklinville as a modern distillery in Ulster making pot still, or Irish pot still towards it, and so that was a very specific project. Whereas this, what I'm doing with Boann is the thesis. This is the real. I have to wear a very different set of gloves with this. And when you look at these old records, it's really, they're not mash bills in the sense that, you know, things have gotten much more exact over time. What you're looking at, house practice, yes, but it varies. They're using 100-weight sacks. Things oscillate, you know, and you're really talking in brackets. And from those brackets, you can see that some people do have very different house practice to other people, but they're not, you know, they're in vibration, as it were. So all of these have been put into sets of 5 and 10%, you know, going up and down. And eventually it's going to culminate in this sensory panel. And again, it's 20 to 25 blenders and distillers. I thought we'd be scrambling for people. We're now in the happy place, but still difficult, where we're wondering if will people feel slighted if they weren't invited, because you know, it's filled up so quickly. And honestly, it's not that. If you were in my phone, if you were in Willie Murphy's phone contacts or Jack O'Shea's phone contacts, you've been asked already. And we have a few spaces earmarked for criticism, or figures from Whiskey Criticism. I don't want to speak for them yet, but those invitations have gone off, and to kind of cross-pollinate the gene pool a bit. But other than that, it's all there's 5 roles off for adjacent roles and criticism. So John Quinn is there as the one brand ambassador, which, you know, I think he more than heavily deserves. And Mick Fogarty is there on behalf of retail and on trade. And again, A, he massively deserves and supremely qualified, but B, he's also, you know, supplying all this stuff. So
that's amazing.
Absolutely. And then the remaining 3 are held for credit.
I have to say, when you first raised the idea of the whole project to me, I thought, how the hell are you going to get people involved in this? Because I mean, it's physically going to a location as well. There's quite a bit of a commitment, but obviously the research has caught the imagination of a lot of people, and it's an interesting project.
There's been a lot, and an enormous. It's quite emotional, really. There's been so much. I cashed in all my goodwill chips here and there, calling people on the phone, you know, saying, "Is there anything I can do for you guys in return?" There's Jack there. Jack was super human about finding people and talking to them on my behalf. I had a massive team behind me, and by massive I mean like 4 people who were just incredibly energetic. But even that, I tried to make sure to call anyone who was contacted by someone else. I tried to call up, and the love on the phone was so overbearing. The curiosity, the fact that it's trade neutral, the fact that the results belong to everybody, that it goes out, and nobody owns the information. That I have no agenda. It's important that I have no agenda. In fact, it's for data preservation. I can't want to go in and find results. If the results say everyone prefers the one most boring mash I'm not interested in, that's the fact. That's what I take away. But the sample, we could not ask for the better, and we're still waiting for some people to get back. So it's only growing.
So the idea is they spend the day sampling a large amount of whiskies. I won't say a number because is it new make? It'll be obviously it's new make. They'll be sampling
new make spirit at varying strength. So we will tell them what alcohol content it is, because obviously we're legally obliged to do that, and it'll be at roughly 60-40-20. So cask strength ish, or cask fill level ish, release level ish, and blending level ish. And they'll be given water to add, but it's all exactly the same. It has to be the same increments of water, and they have to add them just as one. You can't choose how much water. So you either had it with water or without, and you put it in. It all has to be as controlled as possible. We can't mail anything out because, again, there's this, as Michael was reminding me. There's whole essays written on why coffee tastes different coming out of a red mug than a black mug. There's so many things that can influence the way people encounter it.
Sure.
So you're trying, and people already, again, biologically wired different. They have different memories. They have different cues. So you're swimming against a ferocious try to turn something highly, essentially subjective into objective data. And, they're given cards. There's one bit that's a bit more crack, where it's modeled off of international competitions, and they can actually talk to each other. But
so there's no reference, so they can't talk to each other during the tasting.
The other half of it is just you go to a table. There's 4 glasses in front of you. You don't know what they are. You're given a card. It says, please rank from sweetest to driest. Please rank from most pungent to least pungent, etc. And these have been based. There's a lot of these things done in wine, much more so than spirits. And so a lot of this modeling I stole shamelessly from the wine world. In terms of how you try and create that data. So it's a huge ask. You're asking people to hike through mountains of new make for little more than a thank you in the acknowledgements. And yet at the same time, but again, to have that, and we were starved to crack. It's great to have, obviously it'll be done with social distance, and that's a big thing we've had to.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And again, the testing bit actually lends itself to social distance, because you want people to be away from each other, because you don't want anyone feeling nervous. It's all internally anonymized. You have to make sure people psychologically are on the same page. Everything you can think of. So that's already that. We can't do it if the country's on lockdown. So I've been emailing people and I've given them placeholder dates and saying, right, okay, if it's not this date, we wait for the next one. If it's not that, we wait for the next one, and we just have to roll with the punches. And nightmare scenario, absolute abyss scenario we have to do it outside. But we have to do it in the same place at some point, and again, Boann have been superhumanly patient, but it's and of course, the minute all this stuff is over, when they've been through this, I can tell them anything about them. I can tell them all. In fact, I intend to tell them, that second, hopefully lockdown pending in a nearby pub. Maybe even Mulligan's are open when all this happens. What all this stuff was, because it's only being held for data purity at the moment. It's a hiccup. The ultimate intention of all of this is to make it to make it a gift back to the industry, and that's why it's so heartfelt to see the industry so interested in doing it, because it really means a lot to me.
Yeah. So what's the end game then, Fionnán? Obviously, you don't have an end game in terms of what the result will be. But in terms of, you want to illustrate that there are differences, there aren't differences, or what do you want to do?
Yeah. So the only bad result would be inconclusive results if it's just a scatter chart and nobody agreed with each other. So that's the only real fear I have. But if trends emerge saying people prefer if one adjunct peaks here and then curbs down and whatever, that's data, that's real and that's useful. That can be provided. And we've got a room full of the most well-trained noses in the country, from any number of backgrounds, with any number of products and any number of controls in their heads of their own core spirit. And again, some fingers crossed, some very, very brilliant people from outside the industry. And of course, it's still inherently subjective, but that we can take that and try and create some sort of a map to create at least a framework. When we're talking about, as I think I was saying in Boann, it's so odd. I think people, the Scots have a very different relationship with whiskey history than we do, because there's so much continuous history. You look at Alfred Barnard's whiskey distillery in the Kingdom, and you see the names of places that are still there. Whereas you go to the Irish bit, and it's all really depressing because they've all closed down. And so you're almost kind of in a very old tradition that has, Alzheimer's, and you're trying to recuperate these fragments of memory, but they're there, and you have to reassure yourself that they're yours to play with, that this is real. And that's why I try and make it clear to anyone who's had some of these older distillates what was in them, what was in that Locks I was drinking just now, what was in the Cumber, because it's education, it's knowing how to play with that in different kit and different setup, but even trying to reclaim even scattered aspects of that logic of why anyone would choose to use 30% something versus 20% something, etc. And these have all been, they're not chosen purely for the crack. They're not even, some of them are quite close together and some of them are quite far apart. They're meant to build a matrix to try and create graphs and so forth. So they have been chosen for very specific reasons. And to try, and we have a mash conversion vessel, we have, everything to try and homogenize other variables as best we can.
Yeah, so Chris was asking, would varying the exposure times not benefit the starch conversion rates? Yeah, but I'm presuming all that is under control in terms of having them uniform as well, as much as possible.
Anything we can do, lautering, flow rates, obviously fermentation times, cut points, the big ones, anything and everything we can humanly do to keep them consistent, because then we can look at the mash as as it will still be it'll always be opaque glass, but we can look at them as clearly as possible when we're having this panel sit down. And again, it's an enormous project to see happen so quickly. I know, again, there were people, some of whom have thrown up comments on this, that I knew I could get Brendan down tomorrow morning if that was
going there.
And but I didn't expect the enormous response. I'm amazed. I'm humbled.
So what'll happen? What'll happen, Fionnán? You'll do the research. Let's say there's 10 mash bills. I know there's not that number, but let's say there's 10 mash bills. Will each of those be tasted and scored and rated or analyzed on its own by each individual? They will make notes. You will take all the content and make a statistical judgment on whether such and such has an effect. Is that it all has to be qualified, but and again, the way the cards are written for the data set is quite bone dry. It's rate 1 to 4, 1 to 5, etc. There's optional bits for column for comment, but that'll all be a separate data set itself, qualitative. So there's questions about specific mash builds. So unfortunately, I can't say
it's in there, but again, it's all fingers crossed. It happens very soon. The first placeholder date is early January, and in likelihood, that's if we can ride the Christmas restrictions. Dublin has to be at level 2 when we do. We originally hoped to get some people over from the US. We can't in traveling COVID from the States. We can deal with the UK quite easily, I think. So then, if it's not early January, it's early March. It's the first weekend of a month, and we'll keep that. I've made it clear that's the premise. So if it's not this month, we'll and we can just, try and keep things a bit nimble. But when all of this is done, when it's no longer scientifically, or at least mandated that this stuff be kept under wraps, then it's everybody's. I don't care.
Hopefully Boann will actually release a lot of this now, and have a heritage release.
I don't want to speak for them, but they do intend to. I don't know this because they had me up in front of the camera. They do intend to sell some of it and to, I assume, to retain some of it. But it's been me telling them to keep the mash bills hush, because obviously if they want to sell it to people, then they have to tell them the mash bills. And if I don't want that information out, then they have to wait for me and so forth. So they've been extremely patient, considering the amount of money that's wrapped up in producing all this stuff. Because again, they are big bowl distills. They make an awful lot of product, especially when you're distilling more than once.
Well, look, they're giving you a month of production. That's no small thing. So honestly,
I'm there every morning. I've been given the revenue officer's office. It's hilarious. I could not be more ironic writing about like cruelties of the excise system in a modern revenue office. Because again, an awful lot of downtime. So what I'll do, I work on the thesis during the day, and pop in when the important bits happen, and then I have Michael in to interview after each mash and talk about productional problems, sourcing problems, everything pragmatic, because that's important too, is what all this means in modern context. Does this goo up the kit? Does this low down the yield? All that stuff is also important. It's not just the sensory stuff. And of course, that varies from kit to kit depending on people's setup. But even using Boann as a hallmark and extrapolating either bigger or smaller from there, because it is quite a handy one in that respect. That's part of it as well. So again, it's just, my hope is that this becomes, a foundational platform from which people can recuperate this kind of sensory logic and then say, okay, well, if that's what happens when you beef up the oats or you tone down the rye or you this and that, what would happen if I did this to it and quirked it in a way that hasn't been done before? Recovering that, ultimately, you're just trying to equip people to make decisions of their own and to, what is it Yeats said at the opening of the Abbey Theatre, be bold, be bolder still, be yet more bold and not too bold, be courageous, but have a bit of knowledge under your belt first, and then spread out from there. I mean, what's your hope that will come out of all of this? Obviously, it'll help your thesis, and the thesis will, but this will come out as a separate report in addition to your thesis, will it? Yeah, it'll come out beforehand, certainly. Because again, there's 2 more years of thesis, and a lot of the thesis is history, and that's where I'm most comfortable. Yeah, naturally is archival stuff. Look, it's going to be really exciting to see the results, but actually the process and the idea of using them. But I think what will be really exciting is when it's done, and then going back and saying, well, this was this mash bill, this was that mash bill, and saying, so it opens up new opportunities for new recipes going forward, I presume. Yeah, and it's exactly, you're trying to build some sort of loose, not quite safe, children's play apparatus to try and, put in the monkey bars, and then you can worry about the games themselves. Yeah. And trying to at least put that there. And obviously this is one distillery and one process, triple distilling is one, but at least if we can keep it constant as that parameter, then you superimpose that information on anything that's different from, Brendan's direct fired stills to Ecklinville's setup to whoever, and what people can do. And if they choose to smoke some of this stuff, or if they choose to add, whatever, play around there, there's so many things that can be done and can be extrapolated from. We're talking about one distillery, and you look at like malt whiskey and you talk about still shape and so forth, and this is all one specific setting, and then you extrapolate even the same mash bill, the exact same mash bill across different stills will be as different as it would be with malt. But then you're talking about varying those mash bills, and then you're talking about extrapolating new ideas and new projects from just basic principles. So there's so the well of Irish whiskey. When I was writing A Glass Apart, it was about something that was a specific flavor. And again, hold on. When I try that old red, I'll pour some of the is this the Friend at Hand? So this is pretty much as as good as it gets, in my humble opinion. This is a 25-year-old pot still, heavy pot, sherry cask, you know, the works. And this stuff is viscous. You could paint an old man's living room in this stuff, you know, the dark, musty, again, you know, and it's funny because malt can have sherry, obviously, but it's a different kind of sherry. It's not that same weird, like, medjool date. Everything's a bit thicker, a bit heavier, a bit less sweet with pot still. It's all a bit, you know, arcane. And again, that oil, that strange viscosity, you know, oh my God, this stuff is really...
No, that stuff is really, I mean, that is very viscous. I've had that one.
But pot still, I mean, and this is a great example of it. What draws me back to Irish pot still, that raw barley, you know, as 60% raw barley tumbles down your throat when it's left to do its thing. And the Marrowbone Lane was meant to do that as well. You know,
what it did.
Viscosity that you could sink a battleship with some of this stuff. It's so thick. It's syrup. It's not like malt whiskey in the mouth. It feels very, very different. Yeah. And when I was doing A Glass Apart, it was about drawing a line in the sand in my own head and in the heads of nobody who was listening about the difference of Irish whiskey and how there was this aspect that Irish whiskey wasn't selling, that was down to a few minor brands, largely legacy brands, like Redbreast or Green Spot, and trying... Again, when I began, you know, I was living in San Francisco. I think he's on here tonight, Steve Beale. I was.
Yeah, I saw Steve earlier. Yeah, Steve was here. Are you here, Steve?
In a pub in Berkeley, and he kind of adopted me. And great, you know, again, wonderful fun working for Bushmills, and of course Bushmills makes malt whiskey. So it was the other side of it. So it was when, you know, pasta was always kind of the guilty love. Even when I was there, and then I came back. You know, it's funny because I was up at Bushmills for the BBC and I think, because of course they were very, very keen to go to Bushmills, and we did a whole day of filming just there and talking to Helen, and Bushmills makes incredible, weird. You know, you could cut diamonds with that pineapple mango spirit that Bushmills put in. And again, Coleraine would be something similar, but that was always, again, that's the survivor of another anomalous tradition within Irish whiskey, and you know, there's so many that died, so they're not in competition with each other, but what they're all in competition with is bullshit. And you know, again, having, you know, you look at Scotch whiskey doesn't need to be Johnny Walker, it doesn't need to be Lefroy, it has space for plurality, and I think Irish whiskey has room for that as well. And there are, in the same way that you go to Islay and you feel like you've hit the journey to the center of the earth of Scotch, you know, how could it be more Scotch than this? And yet it is not, you know, Dufftown or someplace that has just as many distilleries. Irish pot still for me is as close as Ireland gets to that sensation of rocking up to Port Ellen on a boat, you know, where you're in a place that is so... Now it's not a place, you know, the old Liberties, you know, the Liberties were the Isla of Irish pot, and in there now, but the old Liberties, the Marrowbone Lane type distilleries are gone, and the mythology, even the drinking of that stuff, is as close as a sensation to that feeling. So obviously there's so many different, and of course Irish whiskey is not beholden to do stuff that has been done before. They can play with concepts. They can, you know, it's like, I remember talking to a very serious Italian chef once when I had a wonderful year on the back of the medieval stuff, just faffing around in Florence, drinking wine for lunch every day. And, you know,
a rough day, yeah.
Wonderful, my God. I had a free card into every museum, so I would just skip tour queues for the crack. I wouldn't even look at the stuff. I'd just get a thrill out of, you know, skipping the line to the David and walking right back out, you know, mad with power. And eating, I found this wonderful, you know, underground cellar where I would again eat like a chicken and a jug of wine for lunch each day. But I remember talking to the guy that ran the place, and he's quite a well-known chef in Italy, and it's not, you know, expensive stuff. He was Anthony Bourdain's guy to visit in Florence and whatnot. He's well known and well loved. But I remember him talking about Italian food, and there's a lot of fuss made in Italian food about a guy named Pellegrino Artusi, who wrote a book called On the Art of Living Well. And it's the original Italian cookbook, basically, the idea to create a cohesive Italian cuisine across these many different areas of the peninsula. And he's saying, my job is not to be Pellegrino Artusi, not to repeat the cookbook. It's to read the cookbook, to play with it, to answer it, not to inertly replicate it. And I think that's where we take the next step again, is when we have all this history and we start to recover what the sensory, what the aromatic and flavorful aspects of these different mashes are. What the hell does rye do as you pair it with raw barley up and down, or wheat do, or oats? Again, they're like the one that was only ever really Ireland's child. Again, Scotch whiskey, if you go way back, fiddled around with oats. But, if we're talking about like whiskey as we know it as a drink is really the 1800s. When we're talking about like uncompounded, barrel-aged, professionally distilled whiskey.
So if I play devil's advocate and I say, look, Fionnán, the past is the past, and, we've moved on, and, we've developed other things. What is it that this history lesson, if you like, what is it we can learn from the past to bring forward and help us replicate and also develop new flavors?
Well, geez, if we don't care about the past, we should all be drinking White Claw. There's a reason this stuff is now. I take them at their word when I read James Talbot Power and people talking about good house practice, and that's more than mash bills. You start to see like what was considered good practice at a given time or in a given place. They hover around each other. They're not wildly. The other thought people say, oh, they're enormously different. I say, no, they actually they differ quite a lot over time, but within certain periods they hover in answer to each other. It was a common, much like bourbon, you have really high rye bourbon, trad bourbon, wheated bourbon, as the kind of staple zones. And you see, similar things emerge. Where were we getting? Oh, right. Why is history important? Because it tastes bloody brilliant. It's amazing. And like, again, a lot of this stuff is so, when you smell that locks, and of course, like the wood was shite. They weren't aged for as long. All they could do was beef up the distillate, and it makes sense that as resources grew, as wood became. Wood today across the whiskey world is so much more understood than it ever was historically. People can engineer proper casks. They can talk about char levels and specific points. They can talk about, etc. Whereas some of these, it's like smelling a rug, and you wonder what the hell is that? And is that just the crap wood mixing with oily spirit, or is it something that's inherent in the oily spirit? There's so many questions, but there are so many things that I only find in very old whiskey, or in a certain degree, some of the very heavy stuff that Middleton do, that they, usually use for blending purposes. But you're looking again, like through a mirror darkly at all of this stuff, and there's so much. Again, that's not to say you can't do stuff that's never been done. You can, my old roommate in California, a guy named Clint, is now running a distillery called Seven Stills, and he distills IPA and porter. And there's no reason you couldn't mess around with just off the wall stuff in tandem. But again, it's hard to find a well so deep and so interesting and so easy to tap as the peculiar reservoir we've been left with, in the peculiar situation of having a huge industry that was very self-conscious and very convinced of its predominance, that essentially disappeared.
Obviously the worry would be that these mash bills and the old recipes would disappear forever and never see the light of day again. So it's great. There is a great sense of looking to the past in terms of mash bills, in terms of heritage grains, even, that sort of thing is opening up possibilities for the future. And
I know Waterford have looked into that quite extensively, different strains of barley. A lot of the records that I've looked at, the preferred strain of, say, the 1940s was something called Sprat Archer. in the 1960s, you see the super strains start to emerge with Golden Promise as the first toe in, and then now you have, Optic and whatnot. But at the same time, there is that, and I don't think that was ever really broken, certainly not in the critical community, that understanding of Irish pot still, when you as oily, as viscous, as thick as that other thing. It became bartenders esoterica for a while, where not a lot of people knew it, but the people who knew and were adamant about it. And you still see a lot of people who are pot, the Willie Murphys, again, pot still will, who are obsessives. And I think pot still draws that in a way that no other whiskey I know of in Irish whiskey at the moment draws obsession. The people like distilleries, they like to see experimentation, they like to see peat come into Irish whiskey, but pot still is one of the few things that's comparable to, say, like American rye or Isle of Scotch, where people are obsessive about it purely because it's it. And they feel a specific devotion to it and want to explore all the different styles of it in great detail. And I think we owe it to ourselves not to let that go. And certainly, we're not even talking about replacing it with the kind of weirdy distilled stout stuff. We're talking about, again, replacing it with sales pitches, which we came very close to doing, trying to rebrand. And again, Irish whiskey was seen as heavy, it was seen as oily, it was seen as musty, and give you a hangover. And there was an attempt when they finally started making blends properly, with Jameson and so forth, to almost go the other way and make them as light as possible, make them as smooth and approachable as possible, and to zone the past. And I think there's so much heritage there. It's so interesting, it's so fascinating. Even to just make it again, you're already drawing a line in the sand because there was so little of it so recently, and the pot still that's being made is, the new ones aren't even the standard pot still, even the like imitative Middleton is not of age yet, and even a lot of the ones that have come out are not of the age that they desire to be, with mashes that are mirrored on Middleton or close there too. We're just seeing the tip of the iceberg. And then when we start talking about old mashes, and I know of course there's, and that's something I get talked to quite a lot about, is the regulation, of course, is an aspect of it. And when I talk about it, again, it's wearing two different gloves, because obviously publicly I've made it very clear how I feel about the GI, and I think we still stay friends with everybody. I can talk like an adult with everyone about that, and similarly try and keep the academic stuff as aloof as possible, because ultimately this is about history, what we're doing here. It's not about a 2020 nomenclatural dispute about labeling. It is about reality as it happened and what those stakes really mean. And it's up to the industry how they decide to handle it internally. Again, I own no distillery. I work for nobody. All of this historical stuff has been provided gratis. I've taken money off you for the articles, but never taken money off them. And of course, it's only a few of them that were part of articles, but it's important, and I sat down with Martin to have a conversation about this. It's important, or he told me it was important that I do respond when asked, because, having privilege to see that information, it's a moral responsibility to answer truthfully, to answer as truthfully as the evidence shows, and without an agenda as far
well,
as
I don't think you've ever made a claim without showing evidence. So I don't think that can be. But I think it's important. It's important that this stuff is not lost, and it does show the amount of flexibility that we have. It shows what we have created in the past was so varied, was so far from the smooth name associated with Irish whiskey, typically, and bringing really interesting flavors back to life. I mean, you are recreating the past.
It's fascinating. It's like painting in colors you've never seen before. If you woke up and saw purple for the first time in your life, and you were told, you're like doing the Jackson Pollock painting with it immediately thereafter, and you think, well, I've never actually seen distilled oats and raw bar. Now I'm upping and lowering percentages and whatnot. Well, again, more properly, Michael is upping and lowering percentages.
Purple is Louise's favorite color. So but yeah, I mean, anything new is it'll be interesting to see what comes out at the end. I mean, that's what I'd be really interested to do. And I hope they are bottled as mementos of the occasion. I'd love to see them come out as
well. Even where I think they intend to be sold, they're sold as themselves. There is definitely the gravitas around them, and I think that's all I can give back to Boann is the aura of the goodwill that they've shown me. And that allows them to talk about them as vintage mash bills is what they're terming them. And what they do going forward with that, is up to them. And obviously, like, it's only, hopefully it's just the opening of a chapter of what can be done, again. And it has changed so much from, and I probably took it to heart in a way I shouldn't have with pot still, where I had such a feeling of, totally undeserved responsibility for making sure that it was understood and made clear at a time where there was, on the one hand, the idea that Irish whiskey should be blended and innocuous, and on the other, that we should all just be making triple distilled Scotch, and that there were ambiguities, there were differences, and that there was this thing that was ripe. So as I saw it, so ripe for the modern plucking, aside from being so historically fascinating. And I think that has happened. You see loads of people looking at it seriously. And we're starting to see variations, even percentage of malt versus raw barley, 50-50, 60-40, 70-30.
Oh, yeah, you're starting to see a lot of that. I mean, what I've noticed myself is I've seen several new distilleries coming out with oats and rye, which were, okay, they're 5% of each. But, I mean, that's something that wasn't there now 5 years ago, 10 years ago. So,
no,
it's great to see.
I mean, and again, the only reason that the categories exist ultimately is to preserve the liquids, and it's just a matter of making sure the categories do their job. It begins and ends for me.
There's a nice comment there from Ken. Really appreciate that you are sharing this with the industry as it creates more variety and possibly better.
I'm telling people what I want to drink, and I'm in a very lucky position where I can do, none of the graft and see it made, and then sometimes be given the credit, which is thoroughly undeserved in most cases.
Look, as I had predicted, I thought the batteries might go, so I have a spare one here. So bear with me, people. But
give me an opportunity to pour the second of these.
No, you have to keep talking now while I do this.
Oh, keep talking. Okay.
Yeah.
There's a question to throw up on the text there.
So there was one question about somebody asking about a particular whiskey that you gave them.
Do they remember which one it was?
So let me just check on that now. Go ahead.
Did you find which one it was?
No. So Julia may be able to ask that question again.
Actually, can you see Julia? Could you throw that question up again?
So her question, I have it here for you. I'll throw that up. There you go.
What is the one you've offered me recently? It was so good. Well, geez, that's a tough question. I don't know Julia. She's an astoundingly gifted consultant. And we had her at the gaff the last time she was in Ireland so that she'd have someone to sleep in Dublin before she caught her plane. I'm amazed that she did catch her plane because we kept her up all night giving her various forms of hooch. So that could be one of many things. But the one I suspect you're talking about is the Maison de Whiskey original 15-year-old Redbreast that was done for the anniversary. And it's funny, it's not modern Redbreast 15. It's a very different drink, but it has and a lot of, in theory, Middleton, of course, make a range of styles of pot still based on whether or not they've, essentially lightened the feints. And And you get, light pot, mod pot, heavy pot, and then infamously a Talesier version of heavy pot, trad pot. And Redbreast is generally light pot and mod pot mixed together in various, cask types. And sometimes they've mixed, with Redbreast 21, some of the older stuff gets heavier stuff tipped in. Redbreast 15, the original Millennium one, was a very beloved release because it had this weird viscosity to it. It was slippery. It was, again, oily, but not in the like battleship sunk oily that I go on about. It's a strange idea that the whole thing is made of some sort of film, that you're kind of never quite done swallowing it. It's vaguely solidinous, and that there's so many things that Middleton do that are amazing and strange and only pop up now and again. And despite I know the Marrowbone Lane was like a 5-page essay, A, me speculating what they were doing to create different flavors, and B, what I thought they could do to create what we wanted, and C, me talking about how much we wanted to have this stuff, and this long blah blah blah. But again, even to me, a lot of it remains quite mysterious how these things crop up. But there is that weird glossy. If you ever get the chance, they popped up on the Maison de Whiskey again recently. Those original 50, the very first release of the 15. And they were slippery. That's better than filmy. They're slippery. There's a weird, like there's so many, and that's one thing I love about pot still. It's easy to go to the extremities. And the way that we go to the extremities with Isle of Scotch and start talking about very peaty stuff, Ardbeg, as opposed to Bowmore. And here, when we talk about like heavy oil and big, again, like chew on it whiskey, we're talking about as heavy as Irish pot still gets, as raw barley can get. Whereas, there's also that Bowmore level kind of stuff where you get all these weird textures in between. And Middleton are so, because again, they were set up to amalgamate 3 very different distilling traditions. And even the name Irish Distillers presupposes monopoly, and of course, when they absorbed Bushmills, they were a monopoly. But I know it's great to be in an environment with so many different distilleries on the go and doing different things. You can never get that with a monopoly. But when there was a monopoly, bizarrely enough, the way Middleton was obliged to set itself up was to be as technically kind of virtuoso in its operations as possible, because they had to play so many fiddles at once. And it means that the kit there and the way they distill is so fascinating. There's only one other distillery I've ever set foot in, which is Buffalo Trace, that was as astounding for how many things they were doing under the one roof. But anyway, certain textures emerge that really click people's tongues. And one of them is that strange, almost velvety pot still. It's thick. It's too thick to be just viscous malt, but it's not oily yet. It just kind of coats your tongue. And that original the Maison de Whiskey Redbreast anniversary release was one of those. So again, it's a cult one. It gets lost because people just think it's Redbreast 15.
Can I question then about what do you make of the state of the current Irish whiskey landscape as a general observation? What are your concerns as it lies now and for the future?
I have to say I have a lot less concerns than I did this time last year or 2 years ago, certainly. I think my biggest concern originally was when new distilleries started coming up that didn't have a whole, there's a number of them, and there still are companies. I read their websites or their briefs, and it's clear that they know a few things about Scotch, and they're kind of extrapolating from there. And it breaks my heart to see the logic. We've already inherited Scotch's logic, just because Scotch whiskey is so huge, and our categories are, with the exception of Irish pot, born from, now there's subtle differences, but largely due with just hiccups of legislation. The fact that we can use non-oak wood, these differences in many cases are accidental. And of course it was a pure accident until people started exploiting it and playing around. But there was a point where I felt morally obliged to talked to Oliver Hughes in a bar once about pot still, because of course when he was setting up Dingle, the original plan was to make malt whiskey, and then by the time he can hold, well, rest his soul, he could hold quite a lot of drinks. So it was a long night getting him at least as emotional as I was. But then he copped on almost immediately. He said, this is what this is going to be a central part of what we do. So I'm not just on the hunt to make everyone make pot still whiskey. That life has passed, or stage has passed, and I think there's enough people now who are doing it, A, with confidence and adamancy, and B, in cases like Brendan was just devil may care, courage, doing odd, bizarre things. And my big fear was that Irish whiskey was going to be timid, was that we were.
But is there the other extreme, Fionnán, then as well? Again, to play devil out, is there the other extreme of things going too far?
Well, that's it. They were going too far already. The idea that we should all just be making innocuous, unpeated, very, very light triple distilled malt. Now, there's nothing wrong with it. In fact, despite all those horrible words I just used for it, like if we were all making Bushmills, grand. Is it historically true? No. And it's important to be honest about a lot of this stuff, because there is a lot. It's in every brand's interest to tell history in its own image, and they all have a role to play, and they're all, Irish Bushmills. Again, is a central part of the history of Irish whiskey, as was Coleraine Malt Distillery before it closed. And they're all part of the fabric, but it's important to talk about that fabric in exciting ways. And again, my fear, it wasn't because a lot of these people, they weren't talking about Bushmills the way I talk about, or my friends talk about Bushmills either. They just picked the two dots, triple distilled is Irish, single malt is premium, that's what we'll do. And it was a paint by numbers, happy trees type scenario that I kept getting pitched, and it terrified me, because it was by people who hadn't even read the full Wikipedia on Irish whiskey. And I don't think that's the case really in terms of who's come forward with long-lasting plans. But there certainly is, of course, the timidity, the question of can I sell pot still as easily as I can sell single malt? And I think Middleton have been so successful with Redbreast and the premium releases and the Powers pot stills and everything they've done, the Middleton single casks, that they've created a space. Whatever you want to say about Middleton in its relation to the little guys, and there's a lot, of course, that they've done. They have created an arena in which to put young pot still, that it doesn't feel as insecure, And that's good. It needs that. Then there's the exciting stuff. And again, I don't want to say the exciting, it's not exciting, but then there's the odd stuff and the strange stuff, the deviant stuff. And that only makes up a tiny, tiny percentage, really. If we're to talk about 36 distilleries, there's 6 people doing wonky, off the beaten trail stuff publicly. Maybe if you were doing it behind closed doors, it's difficult to find, because it's difficult to justify. And especially when you can't even label it under the terms provided, then what the hell are you making? What are you going to sell it as? And that's where regulation really becomes important. In my mind, is securing heritage in a genuine sense, in an honest sense, and and not approaching any of this with cowardice. Trying to say, well, look, Irish whiskey has this enormous heritage. It isn't either we ignore it or we recognize it, or we recognize it in the most monochrome set of colors possible. It is quite possible to have an adult, conversation about this stuff and talk sincerely and genuinely for hours at length, which I'm happy to do anytime. And I know I'm not the only one, about what all of this means, and to allow Irish whiskey, whether it be triple distilled malt or whether it be pot still or whether it be experimental or whether it be anything, to have confidence in itself as a category, to have confidence in its past, to have knowledge of its past, to have sincere engagement with the past and sincere engagement with the future. And that's very different to accusing Irish whiskey of making bewilderingly offbeat things that aren't core. When the idea that tradition in many senses was invented in the 70s to sell Irish whiskey. We're not obliged to make light blends. That's not actually, that history has almost, passingly little precedence behind it. If anything, because the pot still distillers hated the blenders so passionately. you know, and a lot of the blends that were on the go were basically grain whiskey with a little pot still kicked in, if any. You know, you look at like some of these lawsuits, and they were only about 5% malt or pot still additive, most of it under the age of 3, sometimes 10, sometimes, you know, a bit more. So again, like even the column still blends of the era, you know, blended whiskey looks very different on the far side of the big Scotch whiskey barons who started taking the whole thing very seriously, as opposed to the early days where it was a bit of a cowboy show.
The other question then is, do you think pot still is the only way, or our strongest way to define Irish whiskey in a global landscape?
I think it depends what we call pot still. Mash bills around the received mash bill inheritance of Irish whiskey that for most of its lifespan was called Irish pot still. That is definitely the kind of golden goose, I think. There's lots of odd stuff out there that can be reached back. So like I had long chats in the Palace with, you know, Jim Doherty out of Slieve League about Donegal Putchin in a show and peated malt being made in you know the north coast. And again, that's a part of it too, but that's long gone. That's a curiosity revived by a contemporary distillery. There's, you know, the column stills used to run all kinds of wonky stuff. Like again, we have a huge amounts of rye that were run through Irish column stills. It's all based on agricultural history. On the repeal of after the famine, basically, the corn laws were repealed, grain became cheap from export, and then the distilleries capitalized on it, and suddenly you get huge amounts of maize and rye and American grains thumping through columns. And like that's largely a historical accident. It's not somebody sat down and said, hey, you know, it would be really great, but it's still there and it's part of it. And so like I've had conversations with David Boyd Armstrong up in Radamon, who's one of the few people that's talked nostalgically about the old industrial column stills in Belfast and what they were running. And that's history too. So there's this, but that's all far details. If you're talking about playing a card that nobody else can play, it's hard to imagine what could be more of an ace than Irish pot still, that raw barley inheritance. Absolutely.
Yeah. I think Matt has a question here. I think everybody knows the answer to this. So, you know, but hi, Matt. Well, I mean, congratulations to Matt. I mean, Matt has played a huge part in getting you into Boann and convincing everybody to go with your crazy ideas, which aren't crazy, but
absolutely, you know.
No, but
in the arms, Matt. You know, from start to finish. In fact, I can track the phone calls. I remember having the conversation with Matt, and then I got like a WhatsApp later saying, you know, what would you say to having the run of Boann? And, you know, we hadn't even talked about Boann. I've just been talking about how desperate I was to find some place I could do this, and it might work. And Boann was perfect and suited. And again, but yes, so again, like, and it's odd because again, it's important to tell the truth sincerely and honestly, without bullshit, without an agenda. Obviously, I want to see diverse and interesting whiskey, but there's a lot of stuff about the past that needs to be, you know, have the dust blown off of it. And at the same time, I understand the apprehensions that people have. And as part of the thesis, I drew up and I've sent it around to a few people. I had to give a presentation one day to my research council, and I gave a presentation on the GI and solutions I thought would work, and a range of solutions based on conservative or liberal options and what they encapsulated, what they didn't encapsulate, what they allowed for, what they didn't allow for, how true to history they were, how untrue, etc. And look, if it were up to me, and I've said this publicly before, I think it should be 30% malt, 30% raw barley minimum, and then up to 30% wheat, rye, or oats, the heritage grains, because that's what the distillers themselves said in 1908. You know, I don't think there should be maize or any, and I think one of the big fears is, you know, cheap adulterants coming in for the sake of expedience, and I think that does have to be protected, and a cohesive identity has to be maintained. So either you do that or you block it down, you know, by grain, and you say, right, okay, up to 30% oat, 20% wheat, up to 10% rye, that kind of way. You know, you start hyper regulatory. But you look at bourbon with they're like musical nature of bourbon. Is anyone confusing high rye bourbon with rye anytime soon? No. And that's why I thought the Kilbeggan rye, which was really a pot still, was such an interesting accident, because it was 30% rye. So you take the one grain that is most aggressive of the major adjuncts, you push it to the highest in that possibility, and it's the one that has the least historical precedent. It was always the smallest of the three. And so that's as far as it gets from green spot. It's not that far. It still tastes like pot still, you know. So again, it's a question of courage. It's a question of not being timid and thinking that, you know, if you loosen the gates, the barbarians will storm the building, you know, talk. But at the same time, that whole explanation I've just given you, and that proposal is just that. It's a proposal on the back of the research. It is important. It is essential and critical that the research, the stuff we're doing at Boann, and the testing remain aloof in and of itself from contemporary issues. You know, I don't think anyone would walk into that room with an agenda. I think it's a new thing.
No. I mean, you're not trying to change the technical, Paul, by doing this research in terms of the pot
It's not even about changing it. It's about, you know, making sure that history is regarded. I you know, if I don't make a balls of it, you know, I'll finish this in 2 years. I'll turn me into Dr. Me, hopefully, and, you know, walk on. And I don't want the thesis to ever have been about a labeling dispute in 2019. You know, it's about what it says. It's about the trajectory of Irish whiskey mash bills from, you know, 1760 to 1975. And I think I've tried to keep, and the goodwill has been so enormous from the industry for the project, that while I feel responsible to not shy away and not be a child and not be a charlatan and tell the truth when asked based on the research, or, you know, here's me throwing around terms like tell the truth, show the research when asked. It's important also to keep the research itself a research project, and you know, one might inform the me that walks around coming up with ideas, but that me can never go back and say, oh wow, I'd love to see if it turned out this way and blah blah blah, because that's cancerous to research.
Look, I mean, it's a hugely fascinating project, and I think it's massively important piece of work, and I'm glad that it's been taken so warmly by so many distilleries. And I know, you know, the response has been huge, not just here, but you've bodies from abroad. I think who did we want to thank that there are people, obviously Matt, Boann, the distilleries that are taking part, Jack O'Shea, Willie Murphy, who else was Marty from the States.
Yeah, Martin, again, Martin Duffy was another knocker on door. And again, that's been a part of it, is I have so many good friends who have gone out and knocked on doors. And, you know, it is amazing to me to have that response, you know, and to have it be, there hasn't been a whiff of politics. Nobody is, and I don't think anyone has it in them to go in. And again, you've seen how you're one of the few people who've seen how it's laid out, and it is pretty rigorously blinded. So I don't think anyone could walk in with an agenda and push it if they tried. But even if someone goes in psychologically thinking, well, I'm going to really show that such and such is the case or such and such is not the case, I don't think any of the people we have it in them personally to do that. I think they're too in love with what they do.
Yeah. Look, Fionnán, if nothing else, you know, you've kept these old mash bills alive. You've certainly shared your knowledge on pot still with a huge audience, and you know, anybody that isn't captivated by the passion of which you speak about pot still, then I don't know, you know. But I thank you personally very much. I think a lot of our listeners are in awe about the depth of knowledge and the passion of which you speak about it. It is part of our identity. I think it's important, and it'd be very sad to see that lost. So thank you very much from my side. I mean, you've contributed fantastically to the magazine with the 7 Sip series. I've really enjoyed being able to host that, and you giving us the honor to be able to do that. And, you know, as I said, you were very much the inspiration of starting our magazine and our journey. So I wish you the very best of luck with it. I look forward to finding the results.
Who knows?
Who knows? I'm looking forward to trying them. Hopefully, Boann do actually. So a big congratulations to them. That's a big risk, and they've done that. So
honestly, a bit more of it here.
Yeah,
this stuff is mind-bogglingly strange, and it's cool and it's weird and it's it's pot still, but it's different, and again, a lot of this stuff, and I'm using the term pot still because how it logs in my head. In the thesis, obviously the term single pot still didn't exist historically, but some of this stuff goes under various names, whether it be corn whiskey in the original sense of corn as grain or whatever, all these names come and go, but yeah, again, there is that notion of a cohesive, and eventually, again, originally kind of Siamese twin with Scotch, going their separate ways and evolving as at the same time, in the same 2 centuries, more or less, when whiskey became what we call whiskey today. Again, uncompounded, lengthily barrel-aged, matured, strictly cereal wash distillate. So it is part of, and even in the blends, like anyone who had a dad who drank Powers, the 70% of Powers is pot still, and it's been there. It's and that's what's so hard to get away from, is that weird Powers and Guinness backbeat, dry Irish stout, heavy, creamy pints, and big, oily whiskey that could sink in the cream. And it makes me so it's hard to sit in a proper pub and have those two side by side and not feel something.
It's hard to get the creamy Guinness as it was as well. But look,
dry. I mean, Guinness's greatest advertising trick was convincing the world that Guinness was a type of beer. Dry Irish stout in general. Whether it be Murphy or Beamish or one of the craft breweries, there's some amazing craft Irish stouts out there that have big creamy heads as well that work just as, if you take a John's Lane and say I did those classes in the porterhouse, and on the back of that I used to drink staff price, which meant 2 pints, and I'm amazed they didn't throw me out of the place. But my after work drink would be a John's Lane and a porterhouse plain.
Yes, I think we've shared a couple of those together in the old Dingle Whiskey Bar. So listen, Fionnán, I could stay for hours, and we've worn out one battery, so I'll try and leave a little bit of juice in. But is there anything you want to, anybody you want to thank for?
Above all, my family, Boann, Matty, Michael, it couldn't, and I see him there, it couldn't have happened with someone better suited. I remember having so many chats with Mike when he started, when we were going down the whiskey side, being propped up at a stool at Dick Mack's, talking about Dingle in the early days, and seeing him up there doing this stuff, it's no better buchel,
Yeah. Well, fair play to everybody for being involved. Congratulations on getting it to this point, and on your achievements today. And we'll check back in a future episode. I hope all going well. Stay safe, Fionnán. Thank you very much for sharing the great news with us and sharing your insight and your passion with us. And Sláinte, everybody. Have a good evening. Thank you very much, and speak to you soon.
Cheers.
Thank you.
Take care.